Hey everyone, welcome back to your PHP series. If this video is helpful, please be sure to subscribe. Alright, so in this video I want to talk about checking if entered values have a value. So basically, when you have a form, if someone puts something blank, so if it asks for your name, we want to be able to check if that was left blank using our PHP script, because we don't want people leaving required information blank. So within an HTML form, you have the boxes for people to input data. So your name, your username, your password, your email, your location, how much money, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. Well, you want to create what's known as a required field, which means they have to put that information in. So when you're logging in to a website, for example, you'll have your username and then you'll have your password. Those are both required fields because if you don't have your password, if you leave it blank, well then you're not going to get granted access to the account. So with PHP, we want to check to make sure that they put in a value. Alright, so to do this, there's two main functions, which we'll get into all of the concepts of functions with this that we will be using. So there's two main functions. The first one is this, and this says isset. So it's almost like a question. Is the form value set? Well, this is how we write this. And then within here, we can reference that data using the array notation we talked about in the last video. And I'll be getting into that as we make forms in the future. Well, what this function does is it will take our data and it will check if it is set. So that means this function has two outputs, true or false. If the value is set, it would be true. So if it's false, then it would be empty. And then this result, we can test it, so we can check if we get a true result, which means it's set, or we can check if we get a false result, which we can check. Alright, so how this would work is we could use it within an if statement. So in here, we could put our function, and then we could do something here if it's true. Well, what we would do is, because it outputs either true or false, well, that's what if statements test as well. So how convenient. So basically, if true, then this is ran. Well, we could put that function in there, and then the result of that function is going to be used in the testing. So if it is set, we do what's here, and if it's not set, we do the else clause or nothing. So that's the basics of how it works. So the first one that we talked about is set. The next one is empty. What this will do is it will test for an empty value. So that means it has two options. If it's empty, it would be true. If it's not empty, then it would be false. So this one would be empty. This one would be not empty. This is how the basic test works. So we can check if values have inputs using, or if inputs have values using these two functions. Now, there are some problems with these. So for example, isset, that's only going to return a value. I mean, basically, if this is only going to return true if the value is not null, which is basically to say no value. That's what null means. Alright, so that means all of these will give a value. So we have an empty string which has nothing in it, but isset would still count this as true. We could also use 0, for example. Well, that means when someone has a form such as a name, and they leave it blank, and then they submit it, well, this gets sent to the PHP script as an empty string. That just means a string with nothing within the quotation marks. So no spaces, no letters. All it is an opening quotation mark and a closing quotation mark. This is an empty string. That's what will get sent. So that means if they leave it empty, it will still test as true, saying that it is set. So that's also a problem. So how do we fix that? That means we are going to use isset for things that don't have input values. So for example, if you go to a website, you may see this. Well, with this default form here, these are checkboxes, or what you would call radio buttons. You would see this. Now, with this default form here, if it's not modified, this is not going to be able to give us an empty value. So, it's either male or it's either female, and if you don't select one, then it's given as null, not an empty string. So if we select male, so let's say we color in male, so that means female is not colored in, that means it's going to be set. So this will evaluate as true. And if we instead check female, well, this is still going to evaluate as true. And if we don't check any of them, this is going to evaluate as false, which is to say it's not set. So with these kind of things, this function is going to work. If we were to use a input box at text type, well, if it's empty, it's an empty string, which tests as true, which means PHP thinks it's set, but for us, well, there's not really a value. So that's not going to work. And if you put something, it's going to evaluate as true still. So if you use a text box, it's always going to evaluate as true, which is not any testing, because for testing, we want to check if it's false or if it's true. So that means we're going to use isset for things such as radio buttons, where you can only pick one or the other. Empty, on the other hand, is a little different. So basically, if the value is empty, it becomes true. If the value is not empty, it becomes false. So that means if we have a string like this, an input type, and we put nothing, we leave it blank. Well, what empty does is it tests if it has any empty or false. What empty tests is false. So basically, 0, an empty string, or false. All of these, or a null. All of these right here, these are going to test as true. So that means we can sort of flip this around to test, is it not empty? So if it's not empty, that means an empty string with nothing in here, this will evaluate as empty, right? Because a string with nothing in it evaluates as true, right? So I know that's a little confusing, but basically what we're going to do is we're going to test if this has an empty value. So if we want people to put in their name, we can use this empty function to see, is this an empty value? If they put Caleb, well, this is not an empty value. this with nothing in it is an empty value. So it actually does test if it's true or false. Now what we can do is we can flip this around and we can use an exclamation mark, which means not empty. So now we have a new function. The way this works, if it's empty, it's false. If it's not empty, it's true. So as you can see, it kind of flipped things around. So that means we can test this value using not empty. Okay, so let me give you an example. If we put Caleb, is this value not empty?